these sailors and their sailboats made it from Europe to North America when they did. Is this because they had some natural propensity to get in a boat and sail off into the horizon and never return, potentially? No, I mean, that would strike anybody as kind of preposterous, you know? And he carefully reconstructs how this became technologically possible. And it has a lot to do with things that aren't technological at all. It has a lot to do with this pattern of tides and winds in the North Atlantic. He says, first, they figured out, I mean, they knew where the Canary Islands were. Those were well established. And they went to the Canary Islands and they set up a system of production using slaves. And this is also, the Canaries and the Azores and the Madeira Islands all together were this sort of the first outpost of Portuguese colonialism. And he says this was kind of like a pilot. And the pilot then later became applied at this much vaster scale in the New World and also in parts of Asia. Well, how did they get there? He says they discovered they had to figure out how to get back to Portugal. It was easy to get from Portugal to the Canary Islands because, as you can see, the winds and the tides would carry you right there. But that makes it very hard to get back, right? Because the prevailing winds are actually in your face. How are you going to figure that out? Sailing is not something you can do straight into the wind, is it? Right? Yeah? I'm just trying to figure out if anybody's sailed and has any experience. How do you sail into the wind? No, nobody here? Yeah. You tack back and forth. You can go somewhat in the wind, but you can't go straight in the wind. So what they found out, though, was that if you went south with it, you would eventually get out of this predicament. You could make your way in this circle. And now I'm simplifying here. It might seem a little implausible at the scale of the Canary Islands. But what they discovered was this big clockwise pattern that would allow you to get back to Europe essentially by sailing directly away from it, which, again, seems like a kind of massive leap of faith. But it was a circumstance combined with certain technologies, advances in navigation, advances in sailing technology, that kind of thing, which made possible this discovery of the New World. And he's saying they sort of figured this out on a smaller scale first with respect to these islands off of Africa, and that discovery in turn enabled the discovery of much larger areas of the world, including the New World. And he also suggests that the same pattern in reverse assisted them in making it around Africa. You know, you can't go straight down the coast of Africa because the prevailing winds are in your face. But if you end up over here closer to South America, you can actually get into the currents that will carry you around the end of Africa. What's the nature of this kind of explanation? Is this environmental determinism? They discovered the New World because the tides and the currents and the winds were of a certain kind? Not really, sort of. It was a condition of possibility. It made possible this expansion of Portuguese and later Spanish and English sailing ships, the range and where they could go. But it didn't cause it, right? It was just a circumstance that made it possible. And I want to suggest that this is essentially a case of eco-historical contingency. It is not an argument that reduces simply to environmental factors, even though those factors do play important roles. It's the combination of environmental factors with what we can only characterize as social factors. Social, technological, economic, political factors. Technological developments make certain things possible at some times and not at others. So there is, on the one hand, a great deal of attention being paid to environmental factors in this story. After all, this is called ecological imperialism. On the other hand, it remains also firmly grounded in the realm of history and contingency, the possibility that things happen in ways that are contingent on circumstances and not strictly determined by any one cause or factor or driver. And I want to suggest that this is also why the argument is not tautological, because he's not actually saying that the portmanteau biota, the plants and animals and diseases of Europe, necessarily resulted in the Neo-Europes and the domination of European descendants over certain parts of the world. It didn't have to happen, right? It was contingent on factors that were independent of the portmanteau biota themselves. Does that make sense? So thinking about this in terms of this earlier discussion I offered about spatial and temporal scales, and understanding the processes that come together at different scales, interact across those scales to produce outcomes, patterns that we can see in the world today, we can put them up here. These are taken from, well, these are very general categories, right? At very large scales, continents and millennia, even bigger than that. You know, the world as a whole, over hundreds of millions of years, we can think about tectonic drift. And that's a process that changes the distribution of land on Earth, right? It has effects on evolution by natural selection, which is operating, again, at very large scales, but smaller, significantly smaller than tectonic drift. Evolution by artificial selection is still more limited insofar as it's specific to groups of people at specific places. It's operating over thousands of years, but not hundreds of millions of years, at least not yet. Cultural modifications of the environment are at a slightly smaller scale. Human reproduction, on the other hand, happens down here at the scale of families, or maybe tribes, over a period of merely generations, right? Most of the decisions and actions that any individual takes, the decision, for instance, to get in a boat and sail across the Atlantic Ocean even though you don't know if it ever ends, that's a decision that individual people take at much smaller scales. And the question is, how do these different processes relate to each other? Can we really say that tectonic drift caused these sailors to get in their boats and disappear west into the ocean? Of course not. That wouldn't make any sense. But can we say that, in fact, tectonic drift had some kind of effect on the conditions that those sailors found and the circumstances in which they acted, and therefore had some kind of effect on the outcome of their actions? And there we can start to put together, I mean, that pattern of winds and tides is, in fact, strongly affected by the results of tectonic drift, right? The distribution of the continents strongly determines what the ocean does in between them. It's also determined by other things that are even larger scale, but we wouldn't have those currents and tides in that pattern without those continents being where they are. So we start thinking about the specific pieces in Crosby's argument, and we can group them, in a sense, into bigger scale things and smaller scale things, And perhaps we can say that the bigger scale things, such as evolution, tectonic drift, the diffusion of innovations in organisms, perhaps we can say those things are strongly determined by environment or are themselves environmental in nature, right? Sort of beyond human control. Others are clearly very much human social phenomena. The contact of Columbus and other explorers with the peoples of the New World, advances in navigation. When you're talking about diffusion of innovations, it's sort of in this gray area in between. And a great deal of the challenge of an argument like Crosby's is to figure out how to relate between these different scales, and therefore between phenomena that appear to have very different underlying causes and dynamics. Yeah? Would evolution by artificial selection be a human phenomenon? Yes, it can be. Clearly, it can be. Whether the original domestication of plants and animals belongs there is open to discussion, right? And this is something that both Crosby and Jared Diamond bring up. It's like, okay, once upon a time, somebody discovered wheat. But how exactly? Why? If you were a hunter-gatherer and you were accustomed to gathering roots, catching animals to eat, how would you even imagine that there could be such a thing as domesticated wheat, right? How would you decide, how would you come to somehow plant the seeds of some of these wild grasses that grow around you without any input on your part, and somehow decide that, in fact, you should take the seeds off that grass and dig a little furrow in the ground and plant those seeds and then pull out all the other plants as they're growing up so that they don't compete, so that at the end you'll end up with wheat you grew? How would you know that that was going to make more sense than just letting the grass grow by itself and harvesting the wild seed heads, right? It's very, very difficult to ascribe intentionality to that discovery of domestication. I mean, Michael Pollan's made some interesting points about this with respect to corn. You know, is it that humans domesticated corn, or is it that corn domesticated humans, right? You made the same argument about dogs, right? Dogs, by most accounts, are the earliest domesticated animal. Did somebody actually wander around one day and say, oh, that wolf-like creature over there would make a really good pet, and then I could use it to herd my, oh, I don't have any cows, right? No, very likely the wolf-like creature started following the humans because there were reasons. There was food, for instance. There was extra food, and over time, you ended up with something that we call the dog, which it only really differs from the wolf-like creature in the fact that it behaves differently with respect to humans, right? From a genetic evolutionary point of view, it's very similar to the wolf-like creature. So again, it's a curious, you know, is it really the result of some kind of conscious human act or not? Other questions? Is it really 10:23 already? 5-minute break. Okay, let's go ahead and get started again. No problem. All right, so now let's pick up the story. We're interested in the end of the Paleolithic, the end of the Stone Age. We're going to date this to about 13,000 years ago. The last ice age has largely retreated. At this point in time, humans occupy virtually all habitable terrestrial areas of the globe. They are equipped with fire, tools, language, and big brains. These are the tools they have everywhere, pretty much, as far as we know. And they're all hunter-gatherers. Diamond likens this to the beginning of the race, in the sense of there are all these people all around the world, and they're basically at the same starting line, as he calls it. And he then wants to know why people in certain parts of the world went faster than others, as if this all is some great big race. Anyway, 100,000 years ago, people had been limited roughly to this distribution. We're not sure about how much more of Africa and Asia, Eurasia, humans were found on. The question mark for Australia, I think, is actually somewhat misleading. I think we're fairly confident that there weren't people there at that point in time. 30,000 years ago, there were people in Australia and Oceania, and otherwise still basically restricted to Africa and Eurasia. 10,000 years ago, they were everywhere. Humans were across all of the habitable terrestrial areas of the globe, with pockets of higher density in the Middle East and parts of South and East Asia. So this is roughly the point in time that we're talking about. 5,000 years ago, there was great density of peoples, again, in the Middle East, along the Nile River, parts of South and East Asia, also now in Central America and the highlands of South America, and through much of what we think of as Western Europe. Here on the right, we have a table of overall global human population estimated across different points in time, beginning 40,000 years ago. We think there are about 1.5 million people. 10,000 years ago, there were about 10 million. Then you see this remarkable increase between 10,000 years ago and 2,000 years ago, from 10 million to roughly 200 million. And that increase continues from there forward. And it's that period between 10,000 and 2,000 years ago, perhaps, that we're most interested in right now. We know that the end of the Paleolithic, which is marked by the discovery of agriculture and the invention of metal tools, dates to about 10,000 years ago in the Middle East. Other parts of the world, it's more recent. It's roughly 2,000 to 5,000 years ago. 500 years ago, we're up to 450 million people throughout the world, high densities in South Asia, East Asia, Western Europe, parts of other continents. Now, this revolution, this Neolithic revolution, occurred at different locations at different times. I've said this before. It happened sort of independently in different parts of the world at different times. 12,000 years ago to 2,000 years ago, defined by the shift from hunting and gathering to agriculture as the basis of food provisioning. The earliest and most significant site was the Fertile Crescent, centered on the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in what's now Iraq. Right? Domestication and agriculture, grossly speaking, domestication is the process by which selected plant and animal species become dependent on humans for their reproduction. So this is actually putting it slightly differently from what we imagined earlier. It's not just, if you find a wild plant and you harvest a seed off of it and you put it in the ground and you cultivate it and it grows, have you domesticated that plant? No. The plant is not domesticated until it, in fact, needs humans to reproduce and persist. And that might be because the plant evolves over time under artificial selection such that it can't reproduce without certain human activities being practiced in relation to it. And we'll get into that with respect to wheat. It might be because it becomes a plant that needs humans to remove competition. Or in the case of animals, it might be because they actually become dependent upon us for food, right? Some dogs could maybe fend in the wild, hunting and so forth for themselves, but a lot of dogs, they couldn't do that. They might make it for a while, but they're unlikely to flourish as a species or a population without continued inputs of food from humans. Some plants like corn have gotten to the point where they can't even pollinate without our active intervention, right? Hybrids that their seeds are essentially sterile. They can't reproduce on their own. This dramatically increases food production per unit of land and work. And that's key, per unit of land and work. Generating a surplus, enabling larger populations, fixed settlements, more complex division of labor and political organization. These are the things that we associate with this revolution. The overkill hypothesis, as I've said, is a key part of Crosby's argument. And I want to spend the next 15 minutes or so talking about what it is. It's also a key part of Diamond's argument, not surprisingly. But let's focus on Crosby. The question, why did so many large terrestrial animal species rapidly disappear from some continents, Australia, North and South America, but persist in others, Africa and Asia? Remember last time we talked about divergent evolution? We pointed out that there were mastodons. There were all kinds of fascinating, enormous creatures in North and South America roughly 15, 20,000 years ago. There were bison that weighed like 5,000 pounds or something like that. There were giant tree sloths that weighed 1,000 pounds. Wouldn't that be fun, to run into a 1,000-pound tree sloth? And for some reason, most of these megafauna, these large mammals, died. Not just died, they went extinct in Australia, North and South America, Madagascar, a number of smaller islands. There were also large birds, incidentally, enormous birds. And they all went extinct. And then in other parts of the world, like Africa and Asia, they didn't. And this has been a sort of mystery for paleoecologists for a long time. And about 45 years ago, a man by the name of Paul Martin offered this hypothesis, that people killed them. Or rather, the arrival of people in these continents resulted in the extinction of these megafauna. And at the time when he postulated this, the so-called Pleistocene overkill hypothesis, he was laughed out of the room. He was just unmitigated derisive laughter because it seemed so preposterous. And he actually got in a lot of trouble with some advocates of Native American groups because it seemed to fly in the face of the idea that Native Americans lived in harmony with their environment. This argument was, no, in fact, the earliest American humans, in fact, totally disrupted this ecosystem.